And if you want to stay anonymous and turn your video off, you might want to change the name on it as well.
Yeah, maybe. Okay. Anyway, we're recording. You can start now.
All right. Okay, thanks, Carl. Okay, good evening, everybody. So we're here to talk about sense-making in organizations, and over the next hour and a half or so, we'll explain more what we mean by sense-making, what sense-making is, how it relates to the Cynefin framework, for those of you that are familiar with Cynefin. But to get started and to, I suppose, introduce us to some of the concepts around sense-making, we're going to dive into a short check-in activity. Tony.
So if you'd like to grab that and just head towards that address for us, what you'll find there is a simple Google slide. And we'd invite you to pick an image from somewhere on the web that describes your week so far. If you want to get really funky, you can always use a GIF. And if you want to do a GIF, you can insert image by URL is the way we do it. I speak as someone who took about a week to work that out. I suspect everybody else has got there well ahead of me.
I'll put that link in the chat as well if anybody wants to, an easier way of just clicking on that.
Perfect.
Thank you, Carl. So if we jump to that slide 2, which is the empty one, pick an image and tell us about your week.
So Tony, do you say we're putting this on slide 1 or 2 or any slide?
I think on the blank slide 2, because I know the first slide is instructions of how you get to a GIF.
Great, thank you.
So just drop it onto slide 2, should be lovely. Excellent. We've got people working out that GIF thing nice and easy. I'm slightly envious of the flowers and the, although I do recognize, speaking for myself, the idea of can't stop, too busy with the square wheels. That seems entirely appropriate.
Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. For those of you who are still in there, please feel free to sort of add more if you feel like it, but we're also going to move on to the next piece. It's just a useful way just to get a quick sense of where everybody's at this evening. We're conscious it's 7 o'clock in the evening. There's family probably in the background making noise, wanting attention. And you've chosen to be here, and we thank you for that. So we're going to step on. We're going to keep going. We have a number of things we're going to talk about. One of the things we'll talk about, Ken, do you want to take this piece on the model?
Sure. So part of our premise here is that we all, and please feel free to jump in at any time with questions, comments, observations, anything else. Don't feel like you have to wait. But part of our premise here is that collectively we all work with organizations in some capacity, big or small. And we'd like to have some useful tools for gaining some insight into how those organizations work, how to encourage change or nudge change in those organizations, how to understand the impact of change in those organizations, or just the impact of day-to-day activities. So a couple of models that are useful, or certainly that we find useful to draw on are, one is the Satire interaction model, made popular by the therapist Virginia Satire. And she talked about our human processing systems having 4 parts: intake, meaning, significance, response. We take something in, as an information from our surroundings, we give some meaning to that's unique to us. So the meaning I give to an event might be different to the meaning Tony or Carl or any of you give to that same event. I will attach some significance to that meaning based on my filters, my experience, and I'll decide how I'm going to respond. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, Jerry Weinberg made the Satire model very popular in software development circles in many of his books, including Becoming a Change Artist. Glenda O. Yang as well has a complementary model called the adaptive action cycle, in which she talks about 3 very simple questions that work in a cycle: what, so what, and now what. What's happening in our environment, or what just happened? So what does that mean? Why is it significant? And now what? Now that I've seen what's happening and I've attached some significance to it, what am I going to do? How am I going to respond? And a lot of sense making is pretty much about that. It's about understanding the context or the setting that we're in order to attach some meaning or significance to what we're seeing or observing, so that we can take some action appropriate to that context and not just respond in the same way to every action that we see in our context or in our environment. So the process that we're going to talk through this evening involves 4 basic steps: experience, so understanding what's going on in our context through looking at the experiences of people in the organization. Then understanding what about those experiences are significant to the people in the organization. And an important thing to point out here is it's not us trying to interpret what's significant to people. What we'll talk you through is a process for helping people to articulate what's significant to them about the experience. It's a process we call self-signification. The people themselves are telling you what's significant about the experience. And then we look for patterns across a range of experiences. So even if we look at the people on this call, our individual experiences are unique to us. But looking collectively across a set of experiences, we start to see patterns. And if we were one team or one organization, those patterns would apply to that organization. We'll talk more about that as we go through it. And then we look to leverage some insights from the patterns that we're analyzing in order to take some action. We'll talk about the action piece a little later on. Any questions on any of that before we move on? Okay. So we're going to jump right into the first step in this, and that's capturing an experience. So regardless of whether we're doing this in person or online, as we are today, we always start with capturing an experience. And for the purpose of today's exercise, we're going to do that through a Google form. And Tony has just posted a link in the chat window that you can click on. And if you would please go to that link and follow the directions that you'll find there in the Google form. We'll give you, what do we say, Tony, 4 minutes for this one?
Yeah, all sounds good.
So we'll check in with you in 4 minutes. We may be checking in a little before that, but we'll take 4 minutes for this first part of the activity, this first exercise. Please think of an experience and note it in the Google form. So you should all be seeing a Google form that looks like this. Excuse me, like this. Yeah. And so as well as asking you to record an experience, you'll notice the form asks you to give it a title. So that can be something that means something to you. It doesn't have to be directly from the experience. We ask you for your initials or some other identifier because some of the activities we'll do later will relate back to this, and we'd like to be able to draw some correlations, and we'll show you what that looks like. And there are some multiple choice questions related to that experience. There's about 30 seconds of our 4 minutes remaining. We just check in with you all. Do you feel like you need another minute or so? Yes, no, not sure.
I'm done.
More. You're done? Cool. Anybody else? Would another minute be helpful?
I'm done.
Okay, great. Thank you, Matthew. All right, so that's 4 minutes. Okay, so for those of you that have completed the form by now, you'll notice that when you hit submit, there's a link to part 2 of the exercise. So we're going to move straight into part 2 of the activity and have you tell us a little bit more about the experience. So step 2, remember, is what we call signification. It's where we go a little deeper into you telling us about the experience. So the next one should look like this. Okay, so when you click on that second link, and Tony, I think you're posting a direct link to that in the chat window as well.
Yeah.
So you'll see there's a bunch of dots. Oops, and I can't do it when I'm in presentation mode. So you'll see there's a bunch of dots. So just grab a dot. Now imagine if we were in a room doing this on paper with sticky dots, we'd just grab a sticky dot, but we'll do this virtually and just place a dot wherever you think is appropriate in answer to the question that's being asked. And there are 3 slides here.
It's referring back always to the experience you just shared in the previous form.
I take it color doesn't matter.
Correct, Carl. Yeah, no significance to the color. Yeah. Okay, and we'll give this part of the activity 5 minutes. And if we're done sooner, that's great. We'll be checking in with you. So in the first form, you recorded an experience and you answered some basic questions about that experience. In this form, we're going a little deeper and we'll explain what the symbols mean. The triangles we refer to as triads. Down here, we call these dyads. We'll be talking more about these right after this. For now, don't overthink your answer, just relate it to the experience and go with whatever you think is appropriate.
I'm struggling to move the dots. Am I doing something wrong?
No, we're going to blame the internet for this one, Claire. Sometimes the dots are quite small. So let's see, what I've got to do sometimes is just try and position the cursor so that I get a cross shape and then drag it. Or draw a little bounding box around it and then drag it. And then even at that, I end up resizing it sometimes accidentally. So if it's easier, just make it bigger and then move it around.
Right, I'm on my iPad, so I haven't got the icons. That's possibly my problem. I might not be able to do it. I'll try once more. Thank you.
No problem. And if it helps, Claire, or anybody else, if you're on an iPad or some other device like that, we can position your dots for you if you want to tell us where to put them.
Risk of being a pain, I would take someone off on the offer to put my dots on for me.
Yeah, go for it, Claire. Yeah.
Thank you. Shall
I'll jump in. So I just grab one. I'm going to recolor it so you can see which one it is I'm playing with. That's all right. So I'll make it the black one. Can you see that?
Yes, please. Could you put it somewhere in the quadrant of their own decision and team decision, please?
Sort of there-ish or further up?
Perfect. Spot on. That'll be perfect. There's great.
Okay.
Thank you. And on the next one, slap bang in the middle, please.
Got it.
Thanks so much. Sorry.
That's all right.
I have a quick question. Do the colors matter or they don't matter?
Colors don't matter, Aaron.
Okay, good, because I was losing my mind for a second. I was looking for that and thank you.
No problem.
I thought I did something wrong. So.
Not at all.
Claire, are you able to see the next slide, or are you stuck on whatever Ken's put on the screen?
I'm stuck on the screen as I go in and out.
Okay.
No, I've moved on to the next one.
Oh, sorry.
Not at all. No, it's good.
No. So I've got 2 more black ones ready to go when you are, Claire.
Okay, near people, please, for the next one. Up the top.
There we go.
Thank you. And then again up the top for our team, please.
Got it.
Thank you.
My pleasure. And there is going to be another slide in a second, so you may end up having to do another one with me.
Right, sorry, I feel incompetent, thank you.
No, not at all.
Collaboration.
Makes me feel useful,
what it's all about.
So thank you.
Okay. So Claire and Tony, do you want to do the dyad ones, and then I'll wrap up this part?
So Claire, on the top one, where do you think? Too fast on the flow of work? Too slow? No flow? Somewhere?
Somewhere in the middle, please.
Leaning any particular way?
too fast, please.
Got it.
Thank you.
There we go. Is that about right?
Yeah, that was great. That'll do. Thank you.
Okay. And bottom one updates to product. Where would you like that one?
Towards the manual end, about 25% along, please.
Oh, I like it. You're getting specific now.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. That's great. Anybody else need any help with anything before we move on? Okay, so what we're going to do for a moment is look at the patterns that you all just created. So taking this one, I'm going to make it a little bigger here. Okay, so on this screen, we can see some patterns based on the first two triangles, the second two triangles, and the two dyads that we created. Okay, so there's a few things to point out here. The first is the questions that you all just answered constitute what we refer to as a sense-making framework. So the initial question, followed by the questions like the emotional sentiment and the frequency and so on, are all chosen by us in relation to what we want to know about. In this case, let's pretend we're all part of the same organization. The questions are designed to help us get some insight into some things that we want to know more about within our organization. In this case, we're moving on to a more indirect way of finding out information about what's going on in the organization through looking at the experiences of people. So for the two triads here, we're looking at decision making. We're looking at how people are relating to the strategy and vision and direction in the organization. We're looking at what's shaping action in the organization, what's shaping occurrences of events in the organization, and how people, work environment, and process relate to that. And we're looking at activity between groups in the organization. And then finally in the dyad, we're looking at how work is flowing or not flowing in the organization. And we're looking at automation. So all of these are not set in stone. We chose these deliberately because they relate to things that we're interested in finding out more about in the organization. So if you were not interested in automation, for example, you might leave out that last dyad or substitute it with something else. Okay, so let's go to this one for a moment and see, well, what patterns are we noticing from this set of dyads?
A lot of it seems to be focused towards people and their own decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're relating this one as well, Claire, right? The people one and the decisions one. Yeah, absolutely. So there's a cluster of dots around people taking action through their own decision. There's a couple of dots in the middle indicating maybe a balance of all three. There's a couple of dots to the right indicating a balance between people taking their own decision and following policies and procedures. What about strategy, vision, and direction? What can we say about that through this set of experiences?
There's nothing at any of the extremes or in any of the corners for this one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Exactly, Carl. And sometimes we're looking for what's not there as much as what is there. And exactly as you're saying, Carl, the extremes, the corners are empty in this case. There is a biggish cluster around the center and expanding out a little bit, indicating maybe that strategy, vision, and direction is a healthy combination of actionable, relevant, and well communicated in the organization.
And at the same time, there's a couple of examples where it seems to be not applicable. So
yeah.
actually, that there may be significance in that as well. And we've had experiences, both Ken and I, where often we find their vision is well communicated, but perhaps not relevant or actionable, which is occasionally what comes up when it's clustered in a corner.
Exactly. And that may be partly what's happening. If we look at the very bottom dot there, there's at least one, maybe two experiences where the strategy and vision is relevant and it's well communicated, that good balance there, but maybe not particularly actionable. Maybe people can't see how to turn that well communicated relevant strategy into action that's relevant for them. Okay. Does this interpretation make sense? Please feel free to jump in if you've got questions or observations, anything. Okay. So let's look at the next set. And as Claire pointed out already, there's a large cluster veering towards people, shaping outcomes, shaping experiences. What else do we notice in these triads?
So the one on the left, seems like there's a bit of one outlier down in the bottom half, or the bottom third.
Yeah, the pinkish reddish one, Carl.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's an outlier there leaning towards the work environment shaping what happened. So I'd certainly be curious about that one. There is no instance where process alone is shaping the outcome in our organization. And on the right, what do we notice?
It all appears to be at team, well, mostly at team level rather than company or focusing on our customer. It's all on our team and intrinsically looking.
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely, Claire. And you may be thinking, well, this is an example from a group of people who don't necessarily work together day to day, that we're here together for a meetup evening. But the patterns are actually very reflective of what we see quite a lot in organizations. So if we were 100 people from the same team, the same organization, we see quite similar patterns.
And one of the reasons we start with stories and actual experience that tell us what happened is quite often when we talk to people, we say, do you do much with customers? The answer is yes, because of course we do. We're always customer focused. And then you ask for, give me an example of things you've been doing this week that were significant. Were customers involved? Well, perhaps it's a different answer.
Yeah. So here in the right-hand side one, as Tony says, customers are not dominating the activity during the week. There's one experience right in the center where there's a balance between customer, company, and our team. But other than that, most of the activity is between our team, maybe within our company, between our team. Let's look at this third slide. So related to this experience, what can we say about the flow of work? Again, imagine we all work for the same organization. What can we say about the flow of work in this organization?
If that was all in the same organization, I'd be somewhat concerned.
Yeah. And say more about that, Matthew, if you can. What would concern you?
I think that would be suggesting that there's a real imbalance of the way that the work was flowing through the system.
Yeah.
If some people are overloaded and there's too much and it's going far too fast, and at the other end there's people just waiting and there's just waiting for stuff to happen. That's problematic. It suggests that there's an optimal point in reconfiguring the system itself rather than looking outside.
Yeah. No, so you're exactly right, Matthew. And we see this a lot in organizations. We see patterns like this coming from actual organizations where we're all part of the same team, same group. And remember, each one of those dots reflects a different person's experience. So you and I could be in the same team and experiencing flow differently. We could be in the same organization and experiencing it differently. And exactly as you said, Matthew, one group or one person or one group of people could be overloaded while another is waiting, stuck, and not making progress. And just taking this as data without judging it is really useful, because sometimes we have that feeling that things are stuck or moving too slowly or moving too quickly. But by looking at the experiences people are having, we start to get some data to validate those feelings or those hunches, and we can go into more detail on those.
And sometimes two people have asked about the significance of the colours, and sometimes what we might do is give different colours to different people, to different groups, and then the colours do become significant. It might be if you've got an account team and their customers all having a meeting in the room. Put this up and give one lot red dots, another lot blue dots, and then stimulate that conversation.
Yeah. Or different roles within the same company. So maybe give your developers one color, product owners a different color, scrum masters a different color, and see how different roles are experiencing different things within the organization.
It's also one of the things we've done with this, and this is a slightly technical piece, is quite often in organizations we'll have a set of values that say flow is good, for instance, in which case you might have no flow and things are flowing just right. One of the things we do very carefully with this is we always take it to extremes. So we call it opposing negatives. So what does an absence of the value look like? What is an excess? So sometimes with transparency or teamwork or something else, we just go, well, that's a universal good. Well, maybe, but what would it look like if there was too much of it? And in most organizations, that's actually quite a hard thing for them to get their heads around, but a really valuable one to see where people already perceive an excess.
Sometimes, exactly building on that in organizations, you'll hear a mantra that, speed is good. We've got to go faster. We've got to go faster. But sometimes when you go past a certain level of speed, it can be dangerous. Things can get out of control, and looking at those experiences is also useful.
Quick question.
Yeah.
How are you, whenever you sort of put those guardrails on, how do you tend to measure or create some type of telemetry around them? Because I've sort of struggled with that over time, because there's, like you said, these sort of mantras that, the customer's always right. I mean, we all know them, right? It's these, it's like what it is. And so when you try to sort of put, well, is the customer always right when they come up with 53 different ideas and they don't know what they really want? No, of course not. So, I've sort of used that one. That one sort of worked for me, but I'm wondering other approaches that anyone else has used to sort of figure those boundaries out. Does that make sense? I don't know if that was a clear question or not.
It makes sense, Aaron. I'll take a go at answering that from my perspective, and Tony or anybody else if you want to jump in as well. But the first thing that we would do in that sort of context, Aaron, is lead with what we refer to as a non-hypothesis question. So you may well have a situation where somebody is changing their mind 57 times. But if you lead with a yes or no question, like is change happening too frequently? That's a very leading question. So we always try and stay away from those sorts of leading questions and look at things like exactly as we opened with today, give us an experience of something significant. And that's not at all leading. It's not in any way related to somebody changing their mind multiple times. But through that, we get at the experiences that people are having in the organization because the requirements are changing 57 times or whatever the number is. And we get to understand some of the impact of that, not just to that person, but across the broader organization in a way that's not judging and not leading, but looking at the kind of the wider picture of the organization. Tony, do you want to add to that?
No, I think well, I will add to that. So yes, I mean, I think all of that's absolutely. And then building on that, one of the things sometimes we look at, and I use is polarities, if you've come across those, polarity management, and a sense of, so there is customer focus and there is maybe innovation focus or a performance focus or a revenue focus, and how do you balance those? Recognizing it's a dynamic, it's never going to be static. And to your question about guardrails is one of the things we'll come on to in a little while. In terms of guardrails, it can be really difficult to communicate to people that that's the limit, or that's the edge, in abstract terms. One of the things we use these for is more examples like these and fewer examples like these. So actually using narrative to set both direction, but also where those boundaries sit.
We'll be saying more about constraints in a little while, which relate directly to setting guardrails, boundaries in organizations. Okay, other questions before we move on with this? Okay, I'm just going to go back and look at some of the data from the first activity, this one here. So again, these are your responses. So those are the experiences themselves. And one thing that I'll note is we never start by looking at the experiences that people enter. They're there, they're useful data, and we will come back to them. But we always start with looking at the patterns and looking at the bigger picture. So if we take some of these ones, like how do you feel about this experience now? What can we say from the emotional sentiment that was recorded? So we've got 33% strongly positive, 33% negative, neutral, positive. So overall, about 50%, 55%, 55.5% positive or strongly positive. Okay. And again, if we were looking at this from the perspective of our organization, and we saw 55% of the experiences that are significant or positive or strongly positive, that's useful information. Nothing has been recorded as strongly negative, which also is useful information. There are some negative. We might want to dig into the strongly positive ones, see how we amplify those. To Tony's point a moment ago, what are the stories or the experiences that we want to see more of in our organization? We might look to these experiences, the ones that are positive or strongly positive, and what are the experiences we want to see fewer of in our organization? We would start to look at these ones, the ones that are negative, maybe even the ones that are neutral.
It's worth saying one of the things that you may find that organizations who've had employee engagement surveys and things like that boil it all down to a simple figure and then worry about how positive or negative it is. Increasingly, we don't go that route. In terms of a metric, the positivity negative is not a helpful thing. It's actually much more helpful to look at what are the values, what are the shifts we're looking to make in the organization, say on the triads and other places. The positive negative thing, A, is quite easy to get hung up on, and B, people get a sense after a while of, oh, you're looking to improve positivity. Mm-hmm. At which point the data you get in just starts to get perverted in that direction, so it's less than helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've noticed, I mean, I assume everybody here uses CSAT or some version of it, and it just gets completely perverted into the quality metrics.
Yeah.
Where it just, it doesn't tell you anything, right? You'll have a CSAT of, 4.4 in a customer, and then you ask, well, how many references, quals, and strategic programs are we delivering? And people say, well, nothing. And I'm like, well, how can that be a 4.4? So it's a 4.4 in the unstrategic relationship that we have with the client, basically.
Yeah.
And
no, absolutely right, Aaron. And we've done this sort of thing with customer teams, with joint organization customer teams, and the sort of insight you can get from this type of activity is very useful, very actionable, and insightful when especially when compared to the CSAT type approach, or even something like the NPS type approach.
Which I just view NPS as the evolution of people who implemented CSAT and didn't get the results they needed. So they just kind of went NPS. And now I see MPM. I mean, it's just,
Yep.
Yeah. So I'll just move quickly on through these, and please, again, jump in anytime with questions, comments, observations. Why are we sharing these particular experiences? Well, let's look. 37% to celebrate. Okay, so that's really useful information to know about. Why, if I'm a director in an organization and I'm getting hundreds of these responses, absolutely, I want to see the experiences that people are celebrating in my organization. That's really useful. 37.5% to improve things. People want to improve their work environment, want to improve their team, their organization. Again, that's a beautiful thing. It may be an experience with a negative sentiment, but the reason they're sharing is to improve things or to make things better or to celebrate. Those are valuable things. Sometimes people want to vent, get things off their chest. That's also useful. Sometimes people want to express thanks or appreciation. What is it that people in our organization are thankful for? If we can collect a body of those experiences, again, really valuable, powerful stuff.
And we've done this as a one-off. Increasingly in organizations, what we try and do is we build it in as a system where people are just naturally collecting and reporting and journaling to some degree their experiences once a week. That also allows you then, so we didn't get any there to say to warn of an urgent issue. But I know that, say, in some of the health projects that I've got colleagues working on, that's their sentinel thing. That's the thing they're watching for, to go, okay, how many urgent things this week need addressing? And then there's other pieces that we can take at an easier cadence to look at less regularly.
Yeah. It's also useful to know who is involved in the experiences that are significant to people. So again, imagine we're all part of the same organization, and I see, Aaron or Claire are recording some experiences that are happening all the time. They're very frequent, that are negative or strongly negative, and they're sharing those experiences either to warn or to try and improve things. It might be useful to see who's involved in those experiences. Is there a pattern there? The roles that are involved, or conversely, the experiences that are strongly positive or positive. Who's involved in those experiences? Can we discern anything about the interactions based on that? So what makes what, if anything, made the situation more difficult? So again, take a look at this one, and what can you discern about that yourselves? And if we are all one organization, what do you see here that's making the situation more difficult?
So there's a label missing on one. That longest one is actually overburden on the system.
Yeah, so just the way it's being rendered there. Exactly. So overburden on the system is the most dominant impediment, the most dominant thing making our experiences more difficult. Task switching is sort of too much work in process. Task switching, certainly issues. Unused employee creativity, wasted talent, certainly an issue. It's useful to get a sense of these things and the types of experiences that they relate to. And then what's your role? Who are we in this session today? So we've got some Scrum Masters, some coaches, consultants, managers, executives, program managers, team leads, technical architects. And again, useful to, in a relatively small setting like this, it's useful to be able to see a snapshot of these things. As things scale out into much larger groups, it's useful to be able to correlate, well, what sort of experiences are team leads having in the organization? What are the patterns we notice about that? What do we notice about the interactions team leads are having with customers or with engineers? What do we notice about the frequency of communication between managers and executives and coaches in the organization? So through this sort of data, we start to be able to make those sorts of inferences.
Bear in mind at this point, we're still just looking at that signification data.
Yeah.
Whenever we get to anything that makes us go, well, what the hell is going on with this group, with this issue? That's when we go back to the narratives. That's when we go back to the stories.
Yeah. And sometimes it can be useful to scan the titles. You know, we see team maturity, forward fixing a change fail, team bonding, well-being is key. Yeah, so sometimes the titles themselves can be eye-catching as a lead into looking at the narratives that represent the experiences. Now, for the sake of today's call, we're keeping this relatively simple. We have richer tooling for making all of these cross correlations, so you don't have to do it manually. But hopefully you get a sense of the power of this sort of approach and the insights you can gain. And as Tony noted, this is still just looking at the data we spent a few minutes gathering. We gave you 4 minutes to record the first set of data and 5 minutes for the second set. So less than 10 minutes. We get all of this wonderful, rich insight. And the value then becomes, or part of the value at least, becomes the discussions we can have together as a team by looking at the patterns. And the key concept here is what we refer to as disintermediation. So one thing to note is like Tony and I wouldn't take this data away and make our observations on this. We would facilitate a discussion where the people whose data it is and who are responsible for the organization are part of that discussion. A lot of approaches will kind of take the data, summarize it, package it into some nice format and present it as a set of graphs. And you lose a lot of the insight and power of discussion through that sort of approach. So disintermediation is a key part here, where we're constantly connecting people with their own data and they're making the insights into the patterns and the data. Okay, so I'm going to jump back to this.
A quick question. How have you found this as an intervention technique? You know, sort of like a one-off versus a continuous improvement, you know, so in essence, put it into the practices approach. Yeah. And just, you know, what has been your experience when it comes to sort of team maturity and capacity to sort of process this and self-improve versus having to have interventions? Because I've found this sort of, that's this point of friction that I've always sort of discovered is sort of hard to make a call on sometimes.
Yeah. So there's a long answer to that. I know, Tony, do you want to jump?
Sorry.
It sounded like you. No, it's a great discussion. I'm hesitating because I'm going to try and summarize an answer for you in a moment. But Tony, did you have something you wanted to add on that first?
You go.
Yeah. So, and if we have time left over at the end, Aaron, I'd love to dive into that in more detail.
Sure.
But in a nutshell, you asked about one-off interventions versus ongoing continuous improvement. And first thing I'd say is we would design the framework differently for each of those. They're two very different sets of circumstances. So with the ongoing improvement approach, that's usually an intention at the start of maybe a 6-month period, or even a 12-month or a multi-year period in some cases. And we would use the same or very similar, maybe slightly modified framework maybe every 3 months. 3 months is usually a good interval for this sort of thing. Monthly is certainly too frequent, to be doing something like this. So incorporating, and we'll show you some examples actually in a moment from previous work where we've done exactly that. But it allows you to monitor changes over time. But you've got to be intentional about what you want to look at. Why are you doing this? So in the light example that we're using today, we're doing this because we're interested in things like strategy, for example. So if you're part of an organization and you want to know, well, is my strategy message really landing with the organization? If you imagine you're part, and maybe some of you are, if you're part of a globally distributed organization where strategy is rolled out across multiple geographies, across thousands of people, multiple product lines, and you want to understand, is that strategy being received? Is it being acted upon right throughout the organization? Then, you know, we choose something like this, and we'd monitor that every few months and see is it being improved. Similarly with the third one here on, you know, automation. So automation is a key thing for many of the groups that we work with, and everybody says automation is good and important, but this sort of pattern that you all produce today is very typical of many organizations, where automation is important, but most of our stuff is still manual. So automation might be something we want to improve over time, and we would use this as a data gathering activity to understand, well, what's the state of automation, how are our experiences relating to that, and then what actions or experiments do we want to try out? And we'll get to experiments in a little bit, but what action do we want to take around automation, for example? So that's on the ongoing continuous improvement side of things. On the one-off, Aaron, as you mentioned, so a key thing is, partnering with the people responsible for the organization. So in your question, and I'm not assuming anything about your question, but in your question, there's many possibilities. Either it's a one-off intervention just to find out some more information, so it's a broad shot to understand generally some general patterns about the organization, and we've done that where, you know, we would have a fairly wide-reaching framework to understand a number of different aspects, like, you know, the productivity, trust, customer happiness, customer engagement, effectiveness of tools, you know, all sorts of things like that. Or it might be very targeted. Maybe so one example would be, we might have difficulty meeting our commitments to customers. Again, you know, it's a very narrow problem statement compared to the first example, and we want to find out more about why we're having difficulty meeting our commitments to customers, and we can design a sense-making framework around that exact topic. Another key thing for me, and I'll pause after this because there's so much we can say about this, but another key thing around this is there conflict or not within the organization? Because a key element around all of this is people trusting it and feeling safe to respond to it. So do you make the responses anonymous, or do you make them not anonymous, so we can have more open discussions? And if it's a conflict situation, we would approach it differently as well. So again, I'll pause and see if that helps Aaron and others.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
It's also worth just saying on the anonymity thing, one of the things we do, and I use it in other contexts as well with NGOs, sometimes we'll do keep your story confidential, but we still get to see the metadata. So we can still see the patterns, but we may not be able to drill down to that detail level. And the piece about helping people and building a cadence in of how often they see it and a process by which they act on it is really useful. We did actually experiment on one occasion with using this on flip charts for stand-ups, which became really quite useful for the people just to reflect back, oh, I thought yesterday went this way, but clearly the pattern for us all as a team was something different. So how do we shift today? So you could use it at that level. Just lots of small nudges, very high level pieces.
Yeah. Okay, so as a reminder, these are the 4 steps that we've just been through. We started with recording an experience. And again, another point to make, actually, in an actual session with the team or an organization, we would usually have you go through multiple rounds of recording experiences. So it wouldn't be just a single experience. So we'd have a richer body of data, but it's the same process, just repeated. So we recorded an experience, you recorded an experience. You told us what was significant about that experience by answering questions in a framework that we designed. Together, we looked at some patterns around the data that you generated, and we came up with some insights. You know, automation not implemented particularly well, for example, or a lot of our stuff being manual. So that's a simple 4-step process. experience, signification, patterns, and insights. So we'll look at a couple of examples, Tony.
Sure. So these were actually taken from a client of ours. We've got them reversed. So on the right-hand side, you've got the previous year. On the left-hand side, you've got the year as we'd just done it. This was in December last year. So you can see in year 1, 2018, there was a lack they perceived in behaving according to ethical principles, which for this organization was a serious issue because they were a highly visionary, purpose-led organization. So they were worried about that. The color coding, as you can see on the right-hand side there, orange is negative, blue is positive. We used to do red and green for negative and positive until I met Carl, who pointed out that some people are colorblind. So we've ended up going that route instead. Now, a year later, so this was stories they had gathered from their partners, suppliers, and customers. So they were talking about the people in the organization. So there was a real concern. They implemented a whole lot of pieces and small experiments and nudges to get people behaving differently. And when they came back a year later to reassess, the pattern had shifted quite significantly to actually cover much more ethical principle behavior. So it wasn't that that's the right way. You're always going to have a balance of these things. There's no right answer to any of these. But we could see very clearly there'd been a shift. If we wanted to go deeper into this, we could actually come up with numerical values for this, because you get 3 numerical values for each of the 3 corners. So you can actually track things more carefully than that and work out all sorts of stats for those who are statisticians. Although, bluntly, in a complex situation like dealing with culture, human sense making is as effective as anything else. And the next slide was actually, again, this was from an external perspective. How do you perceive the internal organization? And there was a real strong sense that there's no change. There just isn't enough change, which was a shock to people in the organization who felt we're continually changing, and actually we're changing too much for our external partners to be able to keep up with us. So getting their external perspective was really clear. And then a year later, no, we found a better balance. And in fact, we saw a lot more positivity. And that positivity, as you can see, is more spread, but it is somewhat in the middle. So again, we've got an excess of change at one end, we've got an absence of change at the other. Somewhere in the middle looks much healthier in terms of how we're going ahead with that.
Okay, so we want to relate some of what we're talking about to the Cynefin framework. And just to give us a sense, just a quick show of hands or anything, if you're familiar with the Cynefin framework. Yeah, great, excellent. Okay, so Cynefin sense-making framework created by Dave Snowden and Cognitive Edge. Yeah, it's got 5 domains: obvious, complicated, complex, chaotic, and in the middle we've got disorder. And recognizing that a couple of those domains have been renamed recently, so obvious is now clear, for example. Tony, do you want to take this one and the next couple?
Okay, so just very, very quickly, I mean, this is just a way of determining what we're dealing with. And in most experiences and most situations, we'll find elements of all of these at the same time. Obvious are things that play out very straightforwardly. They're easily recognizable. We all see it the same way. It doesn't matter what organization you're in, what day of the week it is, happens the same way. And there we can have best practice. In the world of the complicated are constrained systems. So you want somebody who's an expert, or you want to do the analysis yourself. And again, it's repeatable there. The context doesn't matter massively, but the distance between cause and effect is such that you might need to do some more research, you might need to understand things better. I tend to come down into the bottom left then and go to the chaotic domain. We talk about cause and effect. There's so many things going on, you get no sense of a pattern going on there. Another word that Dave and I talked about using for this was random. There are no constraints, it's just forever pinging off. It's a really rapid space. It doesn't last very long before patterns start to emerge. And if you feel you're in a chaotic space, you have to act quickly. You can't wait to take an assessment there. You act to create stability. You can either drag it back over to the obvious, or you can experiment your way up into the complex space. And the complex space is where you've got cause and effect, but they all seem to interact. There's so many feedback loops, some of which you're aware of, many of which you won't be. And patterns will start to emerge, but you won't be able to predict with confidence. I did get picked up in London when I was running a course with Dave. I said, you can't predict. And somebody said, you can predict, it'll just be wrong. So yeah, congratulations, we can all predict, but not with any accuracy and confidence in the complex space. You might see patterns and you might have a sense of what those patterns might be, but they probably don't repeat the same way. And one of the things we're seeing now, as everybody's starting to do a debrief on how we've worked in COVID, you get what's called retrospective coherence. So you look backwards from an end result and you can see how it was caused. And you go, yeah, we needed to have stopped it at this point back in time. And usually that's when we add another process or a piece of bureaucracy to make sure that doesn't happen again. And the truth is, when you were sitting at that end of it, there was so much going on, you could not tell what was noise, what was signal. And so therefore, all you've done is added a piece of bureaucracy that's not going to stop it repeating, because next time it'll happen differently anyway. And so in the complex space, you can't have fixed practice. You have to be nudging and testing and other things as well. Thank you, James. Thank you, Claire. Sorry. Enjoy the rest of your evening. In the complex space, there's also an element where things co-evolve and they keep evolving. In the complicated space, you can solve it and it's solved. It's done. If you get somebody in repairing an aircraft, they repair the aircraft and it's okay. It doesn't keep changing while they're not looking. In most of our organizations, I think back to when I worked at IBM, I can remember a site director delivering a speech before he goes away to the entire site going, I just want everyone to be reassured. I know there's a lot of talk, but we're not going to have any redundancies. And he goes away on holiday and he comes back 3 weeks later. And he doesn't get any do-overs. He doesn't get to just take that back and just rework it. Everything has evolved to take that into account now. And that's the place you're in complex. And in the complex world, you need a number of things. You need to understand other people's perspectives on the situation. You need to understand how they're seeing the system. And you also need both the detailed context as well as the abstract stuff. So we tend, numbers don't work in this space terribly well. Our standard employee surveys and the CSATs we've talked about tend to be complicated tools that'll come out with an answer that we're applying in a complex space. And that, frankly, is misleading and quite dangerous. And even worse if you use that as targets. If you start setting targets in a complex space, people will pervert the system to meet the targets. And I'm sure we've all got hundreds of examples of that. And then there's two other things worth knowing about the Cynefin framework if you haven't come across it. One is that central space, the disorder space, which actually I think is increasing in importance. The disorder space is I don't have enough information or I don't know where I sit elsewhere in this system. And sometimes that's a genuine, I don't know, I'm confused. And sometimes it's, I'm trying to avoid making a decision I don't want to make. So we sit in disorder for a while. And one of the things I think a lot of us felt when we were starting with the COVID stuff is we thought we were in chaos, but we weren't. There were things that were actually obvious. Actually, we've still got to get the rent paid or the mortgage paid. We've still got to get food and milk and feed the family. Those are still obvious. Often we put things in disorder because we've got it at too high a level of abstraction. Mm-hmm. If you start with disorder, and increasingly when we're talking to people, we go, put everything in disorder to start with, and then start moving it out into the other domains, rather than put it in domains and then you end up with nothing in disorder. Start in that central space. There's a great exercise for those who've come across it called the 4-point contextualization, which is a lovely way of putting it, and it's standard cognitive edge. It's a great thing to do, to put all of the work you're doing into this space, and then you build a Cynefin framework that allows you then to determine how you deal with the different issues. The final thing that's worth saying on Cynefin, sorry, Aaron, yes.
Oh no, I mean, so I rolled out a little version of this, sort of as a survey without overburdening people with having to explain the methodology, right? Just sort of grab pieces. And it was when we were starting or during the beginning phases of COVID, shutdown, remoting, et cetera. So this is more March timeframe, early March or early mid-March. And because, you know, the corporate mindset is, you know, here's your toolbox. This should, this is what you need, right? And so, you know, we had enough people doing that. So, you know, I wasn't going to add, you know, the frontal assault team. I was looking to kind of flank everybody. So then I put together this simple survey, you know, so SurveyMonkey type, and which in essence focused on the disorder, confusion, you know, and I know it's sort of getting renamed or whatever, but I didn't sort of focus on any of that. I just, you know, what are you afraid of right now? What can we do to help? So, you know, so you box it in, right? We can't fix everything going on right now. We can't fix everything going on in your life even, but we can maybe help you with 3 things. And I sort of did it in a recursive way with different levels in the organization. So think of it as like level 1, 2, and 3 people. And let's say it's a 7-level organization. So I focused a lot on them. And I allowed that sort of cycle to occur for about 2 weeks. I probably did about 20 or so of these that went out. It was a big population, probably 25% of the company, something like that, 20% of the company. And the data was pretty clear. I mean, it was pretty clear in the first day, but, you know, I really wanted the rest of that data. So then when the top down stuff was like normally bombing because, you know, it was just missing the mark by, you know, by 700, you know, kilometers, right? I mean, it you know, I could come in and say, hey, look, this is what people actually say they need help with, which there's very practical things. People said, given the weird circumstance, it'd be great if we had a sort of a, we call them here an EBT card, but they could be a sort of a P card. I know people in Europe sort of call it that too, where it's just a purchasing card. You know, I give you $200 or 200 pounds on Amazon or on Tesco or on whoever, it doesn't matter. And just because I want to keep the food stuff going, I don't want to have to go out. I'm afraid of what's going on. When I go out, I don't know even what's open. And then it was another simple one, which was we need masks or gear for our family, us, etc. And so, you know, it was like 3 or 4 of these. They were all very cheap. I mean, extremely cheap, simple to implement. And of course, massive hostility from the top down engine until after 3 weeks, people started revolting against what they wanted to do. And then we wound up adopting this, you know, kind of on a random Friday anyways. And I sort of learned the value in sort of the water takes you there over the rocks, right? The power of the water, right? You know, sort of from a Zen meditation perspective, you know, I've sort of leaned in on both of those when it comes to Cynefin, treated almost like a Zen property of management. So anyway, so that was a long story, but that was a way I was able to sort of lead from the middle, from the discovery of the confusion, and just basically allow the population to kind of guide us, if that makes any sense. So,
yeah, very much so. And I mean, you know, I'm sure you know with the kind of, you know, you're looking at small safe to fail experiments when you're in that complex space, and that's exactly what you were talking about. Which, to our point earlier, you know, often when you're looking at the stories and you're looking at the patterns, and you're looking at with the people who are working in that context, they'll look at it and go, well, hang on, that's just this. All you need to do is X. You know, I think back, there's an example of some colleagues I work with who were trying to increase collaboration. And one of the things that was site specific, but came bottom up from the data, when they looked at it, they went, why don't we all just take the same lunch hour? But in the canteen, we get rid of any table that seats less than 8 people. And suddenly, you know, tiny little things like that make sense, but they're not a top down. We must all collaborate for a better result.
Yeah,
you know, gets us nowhere.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's great. And you mentioned the sort of go where the flow takes, go with the Wu Wei thing. I think the Taoists talk about.
Yeah, I didn't want to go all the way there, but you know.
So one of the things we often talk about is with these things, you want to deal with the landscape you're working at.
Yeah, that's cool.
And if you've seen some of the SenseMaker stuff that Dave Snowden and others talk about, one of the things we build into this sometimes is actually landscape diagrams. We can look at landscapes to go, okay, this is a direction you can't take the people right now. Where are they not going to go? No matter how hard you push your corporate values at them, they're just never going to go there. On the other hand, here's a direction you could take them. And again, because we do this often using the SenseMaker bigger piece, when we're doing the virtual and the technology informed version, we can build landscapes like this. So for this one, very, very briefly, anything that's a deep, deep point down there is a really stable pattern of behavior. So if you go anywhere near those valleys in the center of that screen, people are going to spiral down. You can go, no, we need to come out of that all you like, but that's steep enough, they're just going to fall in again. And the more you talk about it, the more they'll go there. So actually having an awareness of that, and it'll be different for every organization. It may be different for every site for an organization, depending on where people have come from, what their backgrounds are, all of those cultural issues. And we build these based on those triads. So the other axes are effectively corners taken off triads. And then we run probability stats on this to build these fitness landscapes. I quite like the landscapes, but they can be sometimes difficult to read. So actually we also do contour maps. Although there's a piece of me that now recognizes as so many people don't do map reading anymore because they're working on GPS and sat-nav. This may become more difficult. But effectively what this is telling us is there are certain directions are much easier to take than others if we're trying to move people. So again, these were taken from triads. These were taken from different elements of a SenseMaker project, Sensemaking project, based on stories people told. This one's taken from an NGO and it's anonymized somewhat. The two axes, effectively what they wanted to do here was take people to the right of each of these graphs. And what we had was those 5 different graphs, in the same way you said, what's an obstacle? What is the problem in the story we're talking about? That's exactly the same question we asked there. So they wanted people in the local communities to engage in democracy better, which is a great, wonderful principle to have. However, that top left contour map around corruption says you try and push them in that direction, there's a very good chance they'll rebound or go the other way, away from democracy, because that's how that map falls out. Which makes sense when you look at it. If you believe it's corrupt, you engage in the process, that's just going to help other people line their pockets again. On the other hand, if you look at the one below it, inequality, unfair treatment, there's no way anybody in those narrow, deep, deep valleys on the left-hand side, they're not going anywhere, anytime. So this starts to give us a sense as well to put in front of people to say, okay, what directions can we move in? Where's the water flowing? And how do we build off on that? And we talked earlier on briefly about how we define it by narrative. Each dot on those, if you can see them, is a different story. So we can look at those and we can go, here are the stories of the things we don't want. Here are the stories of the things we do want. Now, what do we suggest we might run in terms of experiments and nudges and other things to move from one to the other? We've very, very briefly, there's 6 core principles from our thinking in terms of working in complexity. One is you're not looking to solve a problem at the center of the whole piece. So you're looking to shift the system, not solve the problem. If you try and solve the problem, you're going to create other ones around it. In terms of the 6 things you need to do, see the system landscape, which could be a snapshot at the beginning. And so just a way of understanding what's possible. We talk about set direction, not destination. So don't have an ideal future state in mind, not a destination, but do set a direction. You don't want any direction. You have to build in diversity of perspective at the start so that you can see different elements of what's going on. But when you get to design interventions, you need to build in diversity of expertise. So 8 different experts, but also people who are experts in the context. So you put it back into other people's hands to build those interventions. when you're dealing in complexity, you're going to get unforeseen consequences you need to be monitoring, and not just for the thing you think you want to achieve, but just to see what other things might come out of this as well. And we talk about taking oblique approaches. There's a great article in the FT from John Kay, who's an economist, called who talks about obliquity. If you've got a significant thing you want to achieve in a complex system, you don't go after it directly. If you go after it directly, you will cause massive problems for yourself. Instead, you look at what are the things that are influencing that? What are the obstacles? What are the drivers or the modulators of all of that? And your experiments, you nudge an experiment, are based around those modulators and obstacles rather than trying to achieve a particular outcome. And that's done at pace, so forgive me. Okay.
Yeah, and picking up on that, how do we actually nudge the system? What's a practical way we can start taking oblique approaches towards nudging a system in the direction that we intended to go? Well, one way is to run experiments, or what we call safe-to-fail experiments. And we do this with the explicit purpose of nudging the system, not directly trying to induce a particular outcome, but trying to nudge the system in a direction. And as Tony emphasized, we're not trying to directly solve a problem with experiments. We're trying to move the system in a particular direction. We're trying to shift the patterns in the system. And remember, a lot of the patterns we've already started to make visible through the sense-making activities we did earlier on. How do we shift those patterns? One way is to run experiments. What does an experiment look like? So there is a structure to an experiment. It's not just go try something out and see what happens. That's not an experiment. An experiment has to have some sort of hypothesis before we begin. We have to have some idea of what our intention is behind running the experiment. So when we're designing an experiment, we have some idea of what it is we're trying to achieve from that experiment. And we can validate that hypothesis as we conduct the experiment. So one thing we do is work with groups through designing experiments, and the set of questions here, and we're not going to do the activity right now, but the set of questions here are designed to help you to basically design a safe-to-fail experiment. And we start by thinking about what are the actions that we're going to take. So if we take something like the automation challenge that we identified earlier, or the lack of focus on customer engagement or activity, we would design an experiment, or multiple experiments, in fact, around each of those areas of activity. We would define some actions that we're going to take. We would have some statement around how this experiment supports our overall objective of being more engaged with customers or having increased automation. How does the experiment or set of experiments we're talking about help us achieve those objectives? When we start to conduct the experiment, what do we expect we'll see that's good? Well, what are the expected signs of success? Not when the experiment is complete, but as the experiment is running. What are the indicators that the experiment is starting to shift the patterns in a direction that we hope it would? And conversely, or well, we'll get to that in a minute. And when we see those expected signs of success, what can we do to encourage more of them in the organization, in the system? How will we amplify those expected signs of success? And conversely then, what are some of the possible signs of failure? It is an experiment. We can't guarantee what the outcome is, otherwise it's not an experiment. So as we start to conduct the experiment, there is a chance that things will start to go in a direction that we don't want, that we're not happy with. And if we start to see some of those expected signs of failure, what are we going to do when we encounter those? How will we either refocus the organization, refocus the experiment, or change course or pivot? What will we do when we start to encounter those potential signs of failure? I'll pause there for a moment and see what questions do you have about this type of approach to experiments.
There's something interesting for me in deciding causality, and I think experiment often implies causality, like clear causality. And one of the things of working in this space is kind of getting people to let go of being able to draw really clear directional causal conclusions.
Yeah.
And I find that a really big challenge. And I tend to, the word experiment implies something for me that is more causal. And sometimes I've had more success personally framing this as a study, rather than but I mean, it's whatever language, it's the difficulty of language, but it's that implication that we can work out A causes B directly, and that doesn't quite come out when you're working in this space.
Yeah, absolutely right, Matthew. And if we take any of the challenges we identified in the patterns earlier, let's say the customer engagement one again, what we would do is not define just one experiment, but we would define a portfolio of experiments around improving customer engagement. And we would be very deliberate about taking what we refer to as naive approaches to trying to address that issue, and be very deliberate about the obliquity of the approaches that we're taking, as Tony referenced earlier. So if we see too many of our experiments are really of the nature, do A so that B will happen. I mean, that's a good indicator, exactly as you're talking about, that we expect that causality. So we're on in our thinking, we're on the right-hand side of the Cynefin framework in that ordered space, whereas really it's a complex problem, and we need to be on the left-hand side in that unordered space where there isn't that direct correlation between cause and effect.
And similarly, if all the experiments are actually succeeding, and everybody, they're all coming up with signs of success, then you're not testing the system.
Yeah.
But then you are failing in your own lack of failure.
Yeah.
Aaron,
yeah.
Yeah. I find that there's this challenge, and I've sort of been adding these tools around organizational integrity and legitimacy, which really aren't in the normal toolbox in the corporate world. They're a little more in the nonprofit world or the mission-based world, or just in other environments, government or defense. Because I find that when the design of the experiments are sort of preordained portfolio-wise around where everyone already pre-agrees they want to go, there's almost a theater to this whole, or performance art to the whole process. And oftentimes just looking for validation down a path that has really nothing to do with a result that is going to change anything. And you wind up just getting, they take 3 years and you get back to where you were and you quote unquote have learned something. I find that trying to disrupt that is what I often focus more of my energy on than trying to get the Scrum-Bond model, of perfection down. Because I find that those initiatives are so set in stone based on annual strategy and budgeting and, the usual process almost every organization goes through, that I find that if you can disrupt some of that, you force leadership to have to square themselves to what their underlying priorities should really be, versus these sort of almost budgetary investment, let's call them performance priorities. That's almost what I've been calling them. Does that make any sense? I don't know if that makes sense to you at all.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, Aaron. One of the things that I'm reflecting is, in the past, we've had success where what we've done is we've gathered the stories from the people right at the front line of stuff, and then present it to the leaders, but in a way that forces them to expose their assumptions. Exactly. Then they see the data, then we have to make sense of that. And also increase the diversity in the room to then develop the interventions. I did one a couple of years ago with the IT director of the European Commission. It's called EU Digit. And it was a brave piece by the leadership. They hadn't seen the results of their user survey that we did through Sensemaker, except they saw it live in a room with 40 others. And there were some shocking results. There were some things that really threw them. But they were then prepared to go, okay, let's play with the Cynefin framework. Let's play with coming up with multiple interventions that actually, to their credit, the guy, the director general turned around at the end and said, I now recognize I've set research teams on the Microsoft problem for the last 2.5 years, and we've made no progress. Today I have 4 experiments that I'm going to set running tomorrow. that will get me answers in the next 2 months. Thank you, Ken.
So this is awesome, and thank you everybody for the questions and the engagement. Carl has rightly sent us a reminder that we are out of time, and so we should pause it there and respect the time boundary. But Carl, I'll hand over to you.
All right, yeah, sorry to interrupt. It was a great conversation. Well, I guess if you want to follow up with Ken and Tony, their details are on the slide there. I'm sure they'll be welcome to kind of keep the conversation going on a different channel somewhere. But yeah, thank you very much, Ken. Thanks, Tony. I'm just going to put the link in the chat just to that kind of Black Lives Matter page that I mentioned at the start, and I shall share the video. We'll upload it to the YouTube channel. And just kind of put links to that on Twitter and LinkedIn and the usual forums. So thanks very much. Thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, everybody.
See you at a future meetup.
Thank
hopefully.
you. That was great.
Right.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. Everyone be safe.